The quiet trade that rewired the system. It wasn't announced. It wasn't debated in public. There was no single headline to mark the moment. Yet one quiet trade changed how the entire financial system moved, measured risk, and understood itself. To understand why this matters today, we have to look beyond crises and focus on mechanics. Because sometimes the most powerful changes do not come from laws or collapses, but from innovations that slip into system and quietly become indispensable. At the center of this story is a simple promise. Risk could be transferred, exposure could be reshaped, uncertainty could be sliced, packaged, and sold to someone else. What once had to be carried could now be moved, and movement in finance is power. At first, the trade looked elegant. Institutions reduced concentration. Balance sheets looked cleaner. Risk appeared diversified rather than eliminated. Losses, if they arrived, would be spread thinly across the system instead of striking one place all at once. The market embraced it quickly. Volume grew. Participants multiplied. The trade became routine, then foundational. It stopped being seen as innovation and started being treated as infrastructure. Few questioned it because it worked for a while. But every transfer creates distance, and distance changes perception. Those who moved risk no longer felt it directly. Those who received it often didn't see its full shape. Responsibility blurred. Ownership softened. The system became efficient at relocation, but less clear about where risk actually lived. This was the reveal beginning to form. The trade had not removed danger. It had redistributed it in ways that made it harder to trace. And what cannot be traced cannot be managed easily. The early tension was invisible. Everything still functioned. Markets were liquid. Institutions were profitable. The system appeared stronger than before. But beneath that strength, something essential had changed. Risk was no longer held. It was circulating. And once risk starts moving freely, the system itself begins to move differently. As the trade spread, its influence deepened far beyond its original purpose. What began as a tool for managing exposure evolved into a foundation for decision-making itself. Institutions no longer asked whether risk existed. They asked where it could be sent. Balance sheets grew lighter on paper. Capital appeared more efficient. Losses felt distant, abstract, and diluted. This distance encouraged confidence. If risk could always be moved, then holding it briefly no longer felt dangerous. Time horizons shortened. Turnover accelerated. Markets adapted quickly. Prices began reflecting not just fundamentals, but the ease with which exposure could be transferred. Liquidity increased in appearance, even as complexity multiplied underneath. The system became faster, more interconnected, and more dependent on continuous motion. This shift altered incentives in subtle ways. Risk managers focused on distribution rather than reduction. Traders optimized for flow rather than durability. Success was measured by the ability to exit, not the ability to endure. Ownership became temporary. Accountability became fragmented. The reveal sharpened here. When risk is constantly in motion, no one feels fully responsible for it. Each participant touches it briefly, assuming it will move on. And because it usually does, the system appears resilient. But resilience built on movement requires one condition above all else: uninterrupted confidence. Early warning signs were easy to dismiss. Correlations rose quietly. Complexity deepened beyond transparency. Models assumed markets would remain liquid enough to absorb transfers indefinitely. After all, they always had. The early conflict took shape beneath the surface. Risk had become fluid, but fluid systems depend on flow. Any interruption, any hesitation, any sudden need to hold rather than move could change everything. The system was no longer structured around absorption. It was structured around circulation. And circulation, when disrupted, behaves very differently than storage. The conflict surfaced the moment circulation slowed. Not stopped, slowed. A pause in trading. A question about valuation. A brief hesitation about who would take the other side. In a system built on constant motion, even small delays carry force. When confidence wavered, risk stopped moving as easily. Positions that were meant to be temporary lingered. Exposure that was supposed to be passed along stayed put. Institutions discovered that holding risk felt very different from transferring it. Balance sheets tightened, liquidity thinned. The elegance of trade faded under pressure. This was the emotional peak. Not panic, but realization. The understanding that the system had optimized for flow rather than endurance, that it had become extremely good at moving risk, and extremely uncomfortable holding it when movement slowed. As hesitation spread, correlations snapped into place. Assets once assumed independent began moving together. Diversification failed not because it was wrong, but because it relied on continuous liquidity to function. When everyone tried to move risk at once, there was nowhere for it to go. Responsibility resurfaced abruptly. Institutions found themselves exposed to risks they believed they no longer owned. Contract designed to distribute loss instead concentrated uncertainty. The system had not lost capital, but it had lost clarity about who was accountable. Decision-making slowed as complexity revealed itself. Few understood the full chain of exposure anymore. Each link assumed the next would absorb pressure. When that assumption failed, the chain tightened instead of dispersing force. This was the heart of the conflict. A system designed around circulation cannot easily switch to containment. The moment movement falters, stress concentrates rapidly. What once looked flexible becomes fragile. What once felt diversified becomes aligned. The quiet trade had done its work too well. It rewired behavior around the expectation of constant exit. And when exit was no longer guaranteed, the system was forced to confront a question it had avoided for years. What happens when risk has to stop moving? The answer was forming. Quickly, the resolution arrived through a hard adjustment rather than a clean fix. The system did not abandon the trade that rewired it. It learned, painfully, that circulation could not be the only strategy. Risk had to be held somewhere by someone when movement failed. The climax was not collapse, but exposure. Institutions were forced to recognize what they actually owned. Balance sheets were re-examined. Guarantees were questioned. The illusion of infinite transfer gave way to the reality of finite absorption. Risk, once fluid, became tangible again. Intervention followed. Not to eliminate the trade, but to slow it. Friction was reintroduced. Transparency was demanded. Capital requirements were reshaped to account for holding risk, not just moving it. The system began relearning an old lesson. Resilience requires capacity, not just velocity. The resolution reshaped behavior. Institutions became more selective about what they transferred and what they retained. Duration mattered again. Accountability returned to the forefront. The trade remained powerful, but was no longer treated as invisible infrastructure. What endured was a sobering insight. Innovation that removes discomfort too effectively also removes awareness. When risk is always someone else's problem, it eventually becomes everyone's problem at once. The quiet trade had not failed. It had succeeded beyond its design. And in doing so, it revealed a truth the system could not ignore. Risk can move, but it must also be owned. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. The quiet